Hello, this is Slow Night Sleepy Stories. Tonight we find ourselves in a deep mountain village where the sun is slowly setting, casting long, tail-like shadows upon the trees. There's a young girl leaning against the trunk of a nut pine tree, gazing vacantly at the distant sky. Amidst the call of the cuckoo and the soft, downy growth of light green moss, there lingers a desperate promise and a tearful longing tucked away in the fold of a silk ribbon. Please, set aside the noise of your busy day for a moment. Now, as if walking along a mountain path guided by Ipuni's heart, let us step slowly into Kim You-jeong's Mountain Village. Sangol, Mountain Village. Written by Kim You-jeong. The sun, which had been looking down from overhead, tilted toward the west, casting long shadows like tails upon the trees. Yet, Ipuni had no thought of gathering mountain herbs. She stood leaning her back against the trunk of an old nut pine, gazing vacantly at the distant sky. The sky had cleared brightly, and white flower-like clouds billowed here and there, moving gracefully. Wondering if those too were clouds, pairs of cranes flocked and flew between them, their collective cries drifting far down to this Supung Valley. All sorts of trees were lush with leaves in every direction, spreading them wide in the sweltering sun and flaunting the fragrance of the mountain village along with the fluttering breeze. In that mid-air, the flying orioles were lovely, fluttering their yellow wings, moving from this branch to that, singing songs of joy-filled happiness. Goi, 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 singing so coquettishly. Smoke tobacco and mow the grass. That place under the rock on the opposite side must surely be the cave where the tiger enters and leaves. Above that gloomy spot, thorn bushes and actinidia vines were tangled in disarray, forming a roof, and whether they could be called stones or not, light green mossy lumps lay scattered about. And today, without fail, the cuckoo flew in, resting its legs on that ridge. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Before long, beads of tears began to form in Ipuni's eyes. As the herb basket thudded to the ground, she covered her face entirely with the hem of the skirt she held in both hands and stood there, sobbing and weeping uncontrollably. Only now did she regret. When the young master left for Seoul to study, why hadn't she clung to him more, insisting on going along? The more she thought of it, the more her heart felt like it would burst. Yet, was it not Ipuni who, evading the mistress's eyes, had tucked a small bundle under her arm and followed him over 20 li into the mountains? Indeed, Ipuni had crossed the mountain ridges and stood waiting at the secluded mountain pass. She had firmly grasped the wrist of the young master as he crossed over, and it wasn't that she hadn't pleaded, "Won't you take me with you?" But tears had simply clouded her vision first, and when the young master, surprised, said sternly, "Why are you here? I told you I'd definitely come in the summer, so go back quickly," she had been momentarily frightened. Yet even so, when she clung to him, begging him to take her, the young master stood dazed for a while and then, patting her back to comfort her, said, "Don't cry, Ipuni. Once I go to Seoul and get settled, I'll come for you." If only Ipuni hadn't been so taken by those words and believed them so readily, she would not have let go of his hand so distressfully. "Do you really promise to take me? Then I'll surely take you in a month's time. Then I'll wait for you." And until the young master's clothes, flickering in the morning sunlight, disappeared far away along the winding mountain ridge and could no longer be seen, Ipuni, fearing someone might see, had hidden herself among the scattered forsythia, biting her skirt string and seeing him off with tears. He had left with such a steadfast promise, but how long exactly was that 1 month? Many months had repeatedly passed, and over a year had gone by, yet the young master did not even send a word of news. To tell the truth, when she first caught the young master's eye under this old nut pine, it wasn't that Ipuni had suggested it first. Considering Ipuni's mother was a house slave to the mistress, her daughter Ipuni was, strictly speaking, a slave of a slave, a lowly girl. Ipuni knew her place, and whenever she was washing clothes alone by the stream, the young master would occasionally rush in, thinking this a prank, and hug her tight and bite her cheek. That appearance of his was rugged and not hateful, but Ipuni had never dared to harbor such thoughts herself. Even on that day, when the mistress said her appetite was gone and told her, "Hey, Ipuni, go pick some herbs," Ipuni was quite glad. She hurried through a few spoonfuls of breakfast and set out with her basket as her companion. Being only 16, she simply liked being favored by the mistress and climbed up this rugged mountain determined to pick lush herbs for her. The dew on the grass had not yet fully dried, and in the grass scattered among the rock crevices, a huge snake was coiled, munching on a toad. Ipuni stood there watching it with bated, gasping breath, when she discovered a bellflower shoot right at her feet. Just as she was about to dig it up with a stick, she unexpectedly heard footsteps behind her. Startled, she turned her head to see when and from where had he followed her. The young master, holding a branch of a water ash tree as a staff in one hand, his red face drenched in sweat, panting and grinning broadly. Because his appearance was so suspicious, Ipuni stared at him with wide eyes. The young master, perhaps feeling a bit sheepish, turned his face away but continued to grin, saying with a voice full of feigned composure, "I came to break off a walking stick." However, Ipuni quickly remembered the scolding from a few days ago when the mistress had stopped her and said, "If you hang around the young master, you'll get beaten." And she shot back sharply, "Why did you follow me? Do you want me to get beaten if the mistress finds out?" But the young master seemed to turn a deaf ear, and still grinning, said with that same composed voice, "I came to break off a walking stick." Only then could Ipuni not help but get angry. "I don't care if I get beaten by the mistress." She muttered this stubbornly to herself, and, as if telling him to stay or go as he pleased, turned her head to dig up the bellflower again. Then the young master suddenly rushed at her without warning. "You think I don't know you'll get beaten?" He held Ipuni tightly from behind and bit her sweaty cheek again, refusing to let go. Ipuni had grown up and played with the young master since childhood. Had she intended such a thing herself, it would have been impossible for her not to have pushed him away to tumble over the rocks. As the young master stood up, brushing off his rump and looking blankly at her while smacking his lips in embarrassment, Ipuni felt pity for his state. While it wasn't that she didn't feel a sense of guilty self-reproach for the sin she committed, when she was grasped by the wrist again and pulled under this nut pine, it is true that she used all her strength to break his grip and scolded him. However, it would be a lie to say that somewhere in her heart, while acting stubborn, there wasn't a thought that wished the young master's strength was just a little bit more. Of course, it was at this moment that Ipuni's face turned red, and she began to harbor cheeky thoughts. "I don't know. I'm going to tell the mistress. I don't know." While feeling quite anxious, she wanted to test the young master's true heart. Who does this to a slave? When she shook off his hand and scolded him roundly, the young master, despite being in this deep and remote mountain, put his mouth to her ear and whispered, "Won't you run away far with me?" So Ipuni truly believed these words. Whether a man could be so struck with fear, the young master didn't even realize he had failed to put the falling matchbox back into his pocket and scurried down the mountain. Until then, Ipuni lay flat on the grass, using the root of the nut pine as a pillow, looking at the blue sky, thinking that if she just ran away far, she would become that young master's lady. She even forgot about picking herbs to present to the mistress. However, after a little while, Ipuni felt somewhat afraid herself and jumped up to look around. Though there were only menacing rocks and dense forests and not a single person to be seen, perhaps it was because the mountain was so rugged, her heart continued to flutter with fear. Yet it wasn't that she didn't feel that agonizing happiness of wanting to be held tight in his arms and tumble together. Is it possible that the young master, after sharing such affection, is now pretending not to know her at all? Wiping her tears with the backs of both hands, she lifted her head, but without any thought of gathering herbs, Ipuni sat under the old nut pine, staring up at the distant sky, losing herself in thoughts of the young master. Thinking about it now, it is indeed resentful. In the end, it was the young master who caused her to be beaten by the mistress, and it was the young master who caused her to suffer all sorts of insults. Not 4 days after she began going up the mountain every day, the mistress must have noticed, or at least suspected. She called the exhausted Ipuni, who was returning in the evening, and sat her down. "You wench, you must tell the truth or I'll kill you." She whipped her with a switch until her buttocks were swollen. Even so, Ipuni stubbornly denied it. This time, her mother rushed in, grabbed her by the hair, and pounded her back 3 or 4 times with her fists. If only it had ended there, but she was locked in a room by the courtyard and not allowed to see the outside world for 3 days. Fed only through a hole in the door and treated harshly, Ipuni could not help but be truly miserable. Late on the last night of her imprisonment, Ipuni sat alone crying, overwhelmed with resentment. She lay down and clung to her mother's waist, crawling into her arms, and finally confessed her inner heart. "Mother, I'm going to live with the young master." Her mother lay there silently, whether she heard or not, and after a long time let out a deep sigh, her eyes already brimming with tears. After another long silence, she opened her mouth to tell a story. That although she was old now, when she was a young bride, she was as pretty as Ipuni, and her grace was so outstanding that she had secretly become involved with a local playboy. But before many months passed, the old mistress found out and stood her up to beat her, and finally, unable to overcome her jealousy, had even rushed at her with a hot branding iron to sear her lower parts. Warning her again and again, she told her that Soksung's family had already been asking for her hand, so she should not set her heart on the young master and must keep herself well, cutting her off firmly. Indeed, had Ipuni not been an only daughter, she would not have been able to come outside even after 3 days. When she finally stepped out the main gate, the world felt a bit wider, and she felt the lightness of a beast that had escaped its cage. She thought that if she could escape this mountain village, surrounded by these hideous mountains, and go out to the broad fields, her joy would be even greater. As she was heading down the path by the stream to weed the pepper field according to her mother's orders, the young master suddenly popped out from the left among the trees and pestered her again to go to the mountain. Since he returned home for vacation from the school in town, he hadn't thought of studying and just spent his days trying to catch her. It was pitiful, yet on the other hand, the mistress was scary. Knowing that if she were caught after just being forgiven, a fierce fire would descend this time, Ipuni tried to soothe him nicely, saying they should go the day after tomorrow. But since he wouldn't listen and insisted on going, she had no choice but to shake him off and run away. Due to the persistent rain, the pepper field she hadn't touched for a while was overgrown with tall weeds. She didn't know where to start, so Ipuni sat in a corner with her skirt tucked in, thinking this too was supposedly weeding. She just pecked at the soil with her hoe, but her mind was entirely fixed on repeating and chewing over her others' words from last night, that a slave cannot live with a master, wondering if they were right or wrong. However, Ipuni vowed to herself, "No matter what, I will definitely live with the young master." She thought that if she became the lady of the house, her mother would essentially become a mistress, so she wondered why her mother was so adamant and felt a bit resentful. She thought deeply about this and that until noon, when the back of her neck was burning. When she looked up, she hadn't even finished one row of the field. She blamed the field itself, thinking, "This damn field," and felt quite exasperated, enough to yawn involuntarily. This time, thinking she would work quickly, Ipuni swung her hoe nimbly and rushed at it. But for some reason, the work wouldn't stick to her hands. Not only that, all sorts of birds were whispering randomly in the bushes by the stream behind her, and a yellow ox grazing in the distance let out a long, drawling moo. Hearing this, Ipuni couldn't help but suddenly feel listless, and the thought of collapsing in the shade of the weeping willow at the edge of the field for a nap came to her immediately. But fearing her mother, she could not bring herself to do it. Thinking it would be better if the law was made so that girls didn't have to work in the fields, Ipuni, out of frustration, jabbed her hoe into the ground and sat wiping the sweat from her face. Then Soksung, perhaps on his way to harvest barley in the field, came wobbling over to the edge of the field with an empty A-frame carrier on his back. He pouted his lips quite insolently and said to Ipuni, "I heard you did that with the young master." Even if a sharpened jade dagger had sliced straight through her chest, it probably wouldn't have been this painful. Apuni didn't even have time to demand where he had heard it. Her face simply turned as red as a carrot. Considering his behavior, she immediately felt a desperate urge to rush at him and bite his ear. But she had a sin on her conscience and lacked the courage to do anything, so she just bowed her head deeply. Seeing this, Seoksung thought he had the upper hand, and truly looking down on Apuni, he even stepped into the middle of the field, stood tall, and said once more in a sour, twisted voice, "I heard you did that with the young master." In the past, he wouldn't even have dreamed of being hit on the buttocks by Apuni with a walking stick, let alone behaving with such insolence. Instead, he would secretly bring melons from his father's orchard and say, "Hey, Apuni, you eat this." Then, even when she spat out, "I won't eat anything you give me," several times, he would insist that she eat it, so Apuni would pretend she had no choice and take it, naturally wiping the dirt off on her skirt hem before biting into it. While she sat eating, he would grab the hoe himself and weed for her with great enthusiasm, just to please her. And to make Apuni laugh, he would roll this way and that in the field furrows with his bear-like body, calling it a trick. When Seoksung's father, wondering where the boy had run off to again, came and saw him weeding someone else's field instead of his own, he was flabbergasted. Suppressing the laughter that was about to burst out and putting on a stern face, he would scold, "You rascal! What are you doing in someone else's field instead of weeding your own?" Then Seoksung, startled, would turn around and, looking awkward while brushing the dirt off his rump, would stubbornly talk back, "I just came to help Apuni weed a bit, so what?" Then his father would not rebuke him further and would just say, "Oh, what a hopeless brat," as he turned away, chuckling quietly where he couldn't be seen. Then Apuni, realizing her situation had become quite awkward, would push him away and treat him harshly, saying loudly enough to be heard over there, "Who told you to weed for me? Go, go away, go," without any thought for the melon she had all read. He finished. Such was their relationship. Ipuni felt her whole body burning with an unusual sense of shame, but after a while, she thought she must pay him back for the humiliation. When a sharp sense of spite pierced her chest, her shoulders and her whole back twitched. She suddenly stood up, looked around, and seeing that everyone was out working and no one was in the inner village as it was broad daylight, she subtly pulled Seoksung's sleeve and led him into the nearby tall sorghum field. The center of the field was cozy and invisible from anywhere, so believing it was okay to speak freely, Ipuni stood Seoksung there. She picked up a pebble from the gaps in the stones scattered in the furrows, one that wouldn't kill him but would definitely hurt, and struck his shin fiercely with it, snarling, "You brat! What did you say?" Seoksung, who had followed her thinking something good might happen, was suddenly struck by a cruel stone. "Ouch!" He cried out and leaped like a deer that had been shot, his eyes becoming as large as king-sized bells. However, Seoksung felt joy rather than anger. Through that stone, he finally realized that his existence was now significant enough to Apuni that she would purposely lead him here and strike him with such force. He grinned mischievously and said again in an even more exaggerated, drawling voice, "I just said you did that with the young master." Ipuni snapped, "What, you rascal?" and glared at him with bloodshot eyes. But this time, she didn't think of picking up another stone. The tears she had been barely holding back suddenly burst out with a sob. "Ugh!" She rushed at him, clinging to Seoksung's clothes and tearing at them. Seoksung immediately realized that making Ipuni cry was a great sin. With wide eyes, he hurriedly said, "No, no, I just said it on purpose. It's not true." He spoke frantically while stroking her back with his hand, and only after saying no dozens of times did he manage to calm her crying. When Ipuni asked him several times in a still sobbing voice, "Are you going to do that again where others can hear? I'll kill you then." "Okay, I won't do it again." He truly vowed never to mention such bad things again. Only then did Ipuni feel relieved, and as she wiped her tears so no trace remained, "Try doing it again, and I'll kill you," she warned him once more. Just as they were about to return to the pepper field, Seoksung suddenly rushed at her, hugged her waist tightly, and said, "Then why did you say you didn't want to marry me into our house?" Even if he had been a bit bothersome, Ipuni thought that if she hadn't worried that the young master might immediately lose his affection for her if he knew of this behavior, she wouldn't have scolded him so severely for something not so significant. She felt regretful even now. In the end, wasn't it Ipuni's pure devotion to the young master that led her to strike the man's cheek like that? Having cleared her heart of the sorrow that filled her with tears and taking her herb basket in hand, Ipuni stood up again and began to climb down through the rough trees on the mountainside, starting to dig up bell roots one by one. Whether it was true or not, she didn't know for sure, but according to the rumors that had drifted from afar, the young master had supposedly fallen for a beautiful lady in Seoul. Not only that, but the mistress was said to be looking for a charming young lady, thinking that an old bachelor would fall ill if left alone. Ipuni had a headache, wondering what all this meant. As she jabbed her digging stick into the ground to dig bell roots, she just stood there leaning on it, while the sun set fruitlessly. Losing her strength, she descended again. Ipuni embraced the towering rock in front of her and looked down from it. In the crevices of the menacing stone wall, clear water was gathered deep and dark, and it held a piece of the red glow of the slanting sky, bordered by green leaves. It was quite beautiful to behold. Using it as a mirror, Ipuni examined her appearance reflected darkly below once more. At one time, the young master had pestered her so much he even fell ill. Although her clothes were shabby, she didn't look hateful even to her own eyes, and her features were decent enough. She couldn't understand the heart of the young master, wondering what she lacked that he would fall for someone else. Before long, resentful tears fell from her eyes. Before they could even form ripples on the calm surface of the water, a large, dark sleeper fish swished up and swallowed them as if they were food. Ipuni gazed vacantly at the clear water like a dazed fool. Suddenly, she wanted to plunge her body in and die cleanly. Or rather, if she were to die, she wanted to be held in her beloved's arms and plunge in together, thump, forgetting all the affairs of the world and dying beautifully. If so, why hadn't she clung to the young master and plunged in when he lay flat on this back, rubbing his cheek against hers, looking down at this water together and comforting her, saying, "Hey, don't cry. Even if I go, would I really stay away forever?" She had been so leisurely then, but was that Ipuni so hungry for life? "Are you really, truly coming this summer?" She had asked several times earlier, and the young master had replied readily, "Of course, I'm coming. Would I not come and leave you behind?" He threw the yellow camellia flower he had broken off into the water and said, "You'd be clever if you knew what this water is, right?" Blinking his eyes, he told a story. Long ago, there was a giant in this mountain, and the country sent soldiers everywhere to catch him. But the giant had swift wings, so he flew through the air and there was no way to catch him. While they were suffering from headaches, one day they finally caught him while he was bathing in this water. The reason was that he had fouled this clean water that God drinks, and anyone who did so would surely receive heavenly punishment. As soon as the water touched his body, his wings melted away. The young master gestured the giant's miserable end, blinking his eyes wide as if in great fear, and then followed with, "How scary! Hey, don't cry. If tears fall into that water, you'll be in big trouble." But Ipuni barely listened to such talk, as it didn't seem very impressive. Thinking she would be completely abandoned if he left for Seoul in a few days, she looked intently at the young master's face and told him to give her a pledge. Then the young master, without the slightest hesitation, tore off one of the ribbons from his waistcoat and tucked it firmly into Ipuni's waistband. "Can't you believe me even with this?" She felt overwhelmed with gratitude and thought that surely he wouldn't forget her as long as she had this, so she felt reassured. Being the act of a gentleman, there would be no change of heart, but thinking carefully, this ribbon couldn't speak. It felt better to have followed him. She suddenly changed her mind and followed him to the pass, but why had she done that? Instead of clinging more and being a burden, she had just sat there, and now she felt only a renewed sense of leisure. She took out the ribbon she had kept carefully on her person and shed tears over it, but it was no use. Only her regrets grew in vain. Yet, had even this been gone, she would have lost the very taste of life. Like every day lately, she had climbed up into this rugged, deep mountain to trace old memories alone, and Ipuni would stand there weeping until the sun went down. All the birds are singing as they did yesterday, and the day is clear, but for some reason, Ipuni hasn't come up yet today. Soksung had come up this mountain, forgetting that his father had told him to go to the town market, sell 3 chickens, and buy salt with the money. He threw the chickens with their legs tied to one side and lay in the shade of the old nut pine, weighty, nang until his eyes were sore. But since Ipuni didn't show up easily, he wondered what was wrong and if she had gotten angry again, feeling anxious so early. If only autumn would hurry and the new grain be harvested, he would be married to Ipuni. What greater joy could there be? Yet he also worried that it would be for naught if Ipuni threw a fit and said she'd rather die without eating. However, Ipuni's attitude, which had been so cold and harsh every day, had suddenly become demure lately, and she didn't even know how to glare at him. This was truly something he couldn't stop dancing about. Furthermore, on a day when it was drizzling, Ipuni was picking corn behind the mistress's house, and when he passed by, she subtly signaled him. When he approached, she whispered in his ear, "Could you write a letter for me?" "Yes, yes, I'll write it. I write well." Soksung was so glad he spoke hurriedly, even saying things he wasn't asked. Then she said that if he did, she would do whatever he asked, so he should write a letter to the young master saying, "Ipuni is still waiting," and told him never to let a word of this out. He thought to himself that he would like to spend all year writing such a letter. It took him 2 whole nights to scribble 5 lines with a dull pencil, and when he came up the mountain to meet Ipuni as promised, his heart pounded with the clear joy of a husband going to meet his wife. He wanted Ipuni to come up quickly so he could ask her what she liked best and sell these chickens to buy her a gift, but she didn't come. Soksung couldn't figure out the reason no matter how much he thought about it. Perhaps the last time when he threatened her, "I wrote this letter, so you must definitely live with me." Even if that was a bit of a mistake, Ipuni had bowed her head and then, showing tears in her eyes, said softly, "Read that letter." Seeing that, she didn't seem that angry. So Soksung stood tall before her and read the letter he had written but couldn't really read himself, faltering. "To the young master, it's been a long time since you left. Why don't you come? It's been a year and a half. Why don't you come? Ipuni spends every night with tears. Ipuni will die then, so come back like a bird." He read it while sweating, but after he finished, Ipuni took it, put it back in the envelope, hid it in her herb basket, and walked down the mountain silently. Descending to the foot of the mountain, a large stream lay before her, and the water crashed and roared against the menacing, scattered rocks. Her mind felt dizzy, so Ipuni carefully picked her way across the rocks and reached this side. But no matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't understand the heart of the young master who had told her to run away far together, but had scurried off to Seoul alone. Even if a man's heart changes, for that young master, who had even been moved to tears while pestering her under the nut pine, to change so completely now, it must be nothing less than an act of God. Ipuni stopped under a poplar tree whose leaves were as spread out as a mountain. She took the letter out of the basket with one hand and hid it in her apron. She was doubtful if the letter Soksung wrote would find its way, and even if it reached the young master, she couldn't be sure if he would be moved and come rushing back. "No, he will come. He's the young master who left this ribbon behind, so surely he won't fail to come even for this letter," she insisted to herself while standing there. She watched the distant mountain pass as the sun set, waiting for the mailman. She knew well enough that the mailman came only once every 3 days at best, and since he had passed by yesterday, she knew he wouldn't come until the day after tomorrow. Yet, like a person deceived by a mountain path, Ipuni felt as if the mailman would appear any moment on that long mountain road that wound around the mountainside. She waited for the mailman with such longing until the sun had completely set and it grew dark. But today, for some reason, the day is clear like yesterday, and the mountain birds are singing, yet Ipuni still shows no sign of coming out.